I kind of always have had that in the back of my mind as a bass player, that your role is to make other people shine and to, create a carpet of confidence for the world around you. That's how you become a good bass player.
Hello and welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. Awesome interview this week. Kevin Chown, an old friend of mine. He's done so much. He's such an inspiring, uplifting guy. You can't help but like Kevin. And you're going to see his interview with me in just a second. But first, if you've ever wanted to learn bass, but you think you're too old or your body won't cooperate or something along those lines, you should know that right now, this minute, there are thousands of people inside the For Bass Players Only community, men and women of all ages. And you know what they're doing? They're learning bass. They're having the time of their life playing music that they love. Come join them and experience that incredible transformation for yourself. You're never too old to groove. So let's play bass. Kevin Chown is an electric bassist from Escanaba, Michigan, best known for his work with Finnish vocalist Tarja Turunen. Forgive me, she's Finnish, so it's not my native tongue. And Chad Smith's Bombastic Meat Bats, a lot easier to say. Kevin's also worked with, boy, oh boy, Paul Gilbert, Sebastian Bach, Uncle Cracker, Chuck Berry, Tiffany, The Supremes, and Tony McAlpine. That's quite a cross section of artists. And he's also performed on over 100 recordings throughout his career. Kevin earned his bachelor's degree in jazz studies from Wayne State University and spent many years honing his skills in Detroit, Michigan, before moving to Los Angeles, California, where he spent about 25 years in the LA music scene. Currently, he's back in Escanaba. Here is my interview with Kevin Chown. Hi, Kevin.
How you doing, John?
Good. I was trying to remember how long we've known each other. I think we met at a NAMM show around 1991, give or take.
It's very, very early in my career. I was still going to Wayne State at the time when I was living in Detroit, and probably one of my first NAMM shows ever. That's right, when I first started heading out to Los Angeles. And if I remember correctly, you were living in Los Angeles, briefly living in Studio City at the time.
That's right. Good memory. I need to back you up for one. Do you know who the very first ever graduate was of the Jazz Studies program at Wayne State University?
I do not know.
I do.
Who's that?
The person I admire in the mirror every morning.
Get out. You were the first person to graduate from Wayne State Jazz Department. I
Yeah.
did not know we had that in common.
Actually, Todd Carlin graduated around the same time, but I gave my recital before he did. So,
What year was that, out of curiosity?
1982.
Wow. So
I
you knew Matt Michaels and
very, very,
Dennis Teeny and Dan Pliskow and
yep.
all the great guys down there.
I just mentioned Dan Plisko in this week's YouTube lesson, something he taught me about walking bass. That's
Mhm.
that I'm going to publish. But I went to University of Michigan Dearborn for a couple of years, and then
Mhm.
I found out about the Jazz Studies program at Wayne State, and I transferred over there. And the guys that you mentioned, Matt Michaels, Dennis Teeny, Dick Shearer. I think Dick Shearer was gone by the time you were there. Jim Hartway and
Yeah.
all the guys. So
Yeah.
yeah, and Dan Plisko I studied with. I also studied with Maxim Janowski for classical double bass.
Nice.
But this is your interview, not my interview. So yeah,
But Detroit's a good place to start. If we have that in common, when you met me, I was just kind of getting I left it. I'm back in Escanaba, Michigan now, which is in the Upper Peninsula, as I was mentioning to you.
you're a
And
Uper.
I'm a Uper again, right back where I started. And Detroit had such a big impact on who I became as a musician because of the wealth and the depth of knowledge of the people that I met when I moved there, people like Matt Michaels, especially. And they were such kind guys too, such um, subtle teachers. They taught you how to become a professional musician. They didn't just teach you how to play an instrument. And there's a difference, right?
Yeah.
So that's where we left off. That was what I was in the middle of the last time I probably chatted with you back in those days. You had just released your first book. I still have a copy of it in my files.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, if you got the early version, it probably has a cassette tape in the cover.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Boy, oh boy. Oh, hey, there's one other name I want to mention. Was Dave Vanderpit there when you were at Wayne State?
That does not ring a bell.
Okay, that's who I studied arranging with. He was the chief staff arranger for Motown for 40.
Oh,
And as the story goes, he was a bass player and a trombone player at Motown. And somebody said, "Hey, I need somebody to write some arrangements. I got three girls coming in tomorrow. They need some charts. Can anybody do it?" And Dave said, "Yeah, I'll do it."
yeah.
Who do you suppose those three girls turned out to be?
Maybe let's say the Supremes.
Yeah, actually, I think I read that in your bio. Yes, the Supremes. So,
Mhm.
not a bad person to study arranging with.
Yeah.
Do you remember that time when we met at the NAM show? We played something together on the bass at some booth. I don't even remember which one it was. Ernie Ball. I don't know what it was, but we were playing a piece together that you had learned and I had learned, and we played it together. Do you remember what that was?
Ooh.
Apparently not.
Was it? I know that it's probably a limited thing. Was it Bach G major cello prelude?
No, you're kind of in the right vibe there. It was the Paganini Moto Perpetuo, perpetual motion.
Yes.
I thought I was the only one that had ever learned that on the bass, but there's someone even more of a bass geek than I am, and his name is
I
Kevin Chown.
I spent a whole summer learning that. It was like talk about a good way to learn how to get chops under you. That's amazing.
Absolutely. Let's go to the beginning. You're originally from Escanaba?
I am born and raised.
Okay, so tell me about your initial exposure to music. Come from a musical family where there brothers and sisters and records playing, and did your parents take you to concerts? And what was your initial exposure to music, and how'd you become a bass player?
Well, I'm the youngest in my family, and I was kind of born into the music business because my mom and my dad were both teachers. And my dad's still alive. He's 95. He's a conductor. Played a whole series of concerts last year. He's still doing his thing. My mom, who passed away some time back, was a piano player and a piano teacher, and also a composer. She used to write for a magazine called Clavier as well, which was a prominent serious piano player magazine at the time. And my sister Karen was and still is a concert violinist and pianist. And my brother Mark, who's passed away, was a great trumpet player, also a composer. And so my house was always full of musicians from the earliest age. So I never have known a life without music. It would have been odd for me not to go into music, unlike a lot of people where it's kind of the exception to the rule. So I had a really kind of deep well to draw from when I first started, taking music seriously myself. And I didn't really want to follow the paths of my parents. I kind of rebelled at first. I refused to take piano lessons from my mom, which was probably one of the greatest regrets of my life. I just wanted to be a, football player or something back in those days. But, I learned so much just by watching not only how they taught people, as a bass player, my mom was most well known as probably being the greatest accompanist that anybody ever met up in this, neck of the woods. She could make a beginner sound like a virtuoso as an accompanist. And I kind of always have had that in the back of my mind as a bass player, that your role is to make other people shine and to, create a carpet of confidence for the world around you. That's how you become a good bass player. And so I really had a nice, philosophical start to my musical career, just because, it was like being born into a tour bus, constant rehearsals in the house, constant concerts. I just found a treasure trove yesterday of, all of the programs um, from my dad and my mom's concerts, and go, honey. Sorry, Julie muted her phone. I apologize.
Uh,
Um,
It sounds like I'm getting the feeling that your family was leaning more toward the classical world, and were you like the funky son, or
When I got involved in music, I was into rock and roll. You know, I had a band. I started in my first band appear in 1985 when I was 15. So that's kind of when I started playing professionally. Because, like in most places, there's just not enough bass players, especially up this way. And I loved, the camaraderie of being in a band. I loved the excitement of it. Um, I loved helping other people have a good time. And that was kind of my era too, the 80s, nothing but a good time. But that kind of piqued my interest. And so that as a result of my interest in rock and roll, it kind of made me look backwards as to where I started with my family. And I remember Dennis Teeny came up to the Escanaba High School when I was a kid. My dad was the head of the music department there, and he brought the Wayne State Jazz Quartet up with, I think Keith Kaminsky was on sax.
oh yeah.
I think Dennis played piano. I can't remember who was on bass or who was on drums, but it had a big impact on me. And I hadn't really thought about going to school for music, but then I saw that, and at the time I was kind of starting to get into some fusion stuff, which was kind of a mix of rock and roll and I guess the sophistication of jazz and chord changes. Probably bands like Spyro Gyra at the time. I saw them live. That was something that really had a big impact on me. But that's kind of what got me to Detroit. But I started looking back once I'd learned things like since I was in rock and roll bands, I was very into Led Zeppelin when I was a
Well,
kid.
excuse me, what instrument were you playing? Were you playing bass?
I've always played bass.
That was your first instrument.
No, I started out on cornet and trumpet in my dad's bands, and he's a concert band conductor. And he used to kind of move me around from section to section to, kind of help him fill out. Sometimes I play trumpet, but there were a lot of good trumpet players. So he threw me in baritone. And then I know how to play drum set too. So I play drum set and various things as well. But what the funny thing is, since I was a rock and roller back in those days, what my parents never knew is I didn't know how to read music back in those days, but I've always had a really good ear. So I would be able to sit anywhere and just kind of pick up on the game plan and play the stuff.
You
Um,
mentioned Dennis Teeny a couple of times. By the way, are you aware that we lost him a few months ago? That's
Absolutely. It was a shame. Yeah.
my most profound memory of Dennis Teeny, and I think this will be of interest to everyone listening, was the day that I was playing in the big band at Wayne State University, and one of the trumpet players didn't show up for rehearsal or he wasn't there. And I think one of the guys had written an arrangement and he really wanted to hear all the horns, everything. Dennis got up and stood in the trumpet section and sang the trumpet part. And the trumpet you have to transpose also. So he was transposing, was it up a second or up a ninth or whatever it was? And I could see him. It was, I will never get that image. I hope I never get that image out of my mind.
Yeah. I think Wayne State is probably the most underrated music program in the country in many ways because, Detroit's got such a rich musical heritage.
Yeah.
With the Motown stuff, or whether it's, all the way back into the jazz era stuff. But they're not necessarily people. It's just like the town. It's like blue collar virtuosos, you know, just like Motown, the recording studio at their time, that was kind of an assembly line of pop music in a way, right? Everybody sat there and cranked on the bolts that they were really good at, and they created a sound as a result of that. And so I was very, very fortunate to get into that way of thinking, because I think as a bass player, you need to think blue collar. You need to think about getting the job done and being practical, and realizing that you're a part of a team, most importantly. And that's always what I got from Detroit. But I think you were asking me, my original start. I think I mentioned I was very into Led Zeppelin when I was a kid, and I remember I learned this Led Zeppelin song called the Lemon Song, which is just a blues, right? When
Yep.
I, when I was a kid, and it's got this funky bass breakdown section. I learned that thing note for note. It was like probably one of the coolest things I learned coming up. But then I moved to Detroit and I started I started getting into Jamerson, and I bought the book Standing in the Shadows of Motown, and I
Oh,
started
it's
learning
right
all.
over there. I can see it from here.
Yeah, one of the that book made a difference in my life. It really did. And just learning all of those Motown, you know, great lines, learning what's going on. Just if you take the time to learn what's going on note for note,
Yep.
it'll change your playing. You see how you can be playful and supportive at the same time. So that's kind of the path that took me to when we first met, actually.
It's funny that I often bring this up when somebody talks about Led Zeppelin or John Paul Jones. I said he must have been into Jamerson because I say the Lemon Song alone. That's such a great R&B, funky James Jamerson type bass line. I just love it. And this is Led Zeppelin, I just love it.
Well, he was a session musician in London. I don't know if you knew this. He's the guy that played on Mellow Yellow, the song.
Played what, bass?
Yeah, that's John Paul Jones on bass.
I never knew that. I know there's a tuba in that song. I know.
I'm just mad about 14. 14. Yeah, that's so he was a big influence of mine at the beginning, and then Jamerson became, kind of the point where that took off next. And I just fell in love with bass playing when I was starting on John Patitucci, and then I went through my six string phase of playing, a lot of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, a lot of slap stuff. I had a book called Slap It.
Yeah, Tony Oppenheim.
Oh, exactly. That book.
There's a better slap book out now, though. Came out.
I know. I heard you. This was before your time, the
Yeah,
pre-John era.
yeah. Don't tell anybody this, but I actually learned some stuff from that book. That orange book, that bright orange cover book.
Still have it. It's fun,
It,
but
it come with it's kind of a record, but it's not really a record. An Evatone sound sheet that you put on the turntable. That's even predating to my cassette in my
we're dating ourselves here, John. We should be careful now.
So
But
you came down to Detroit specifically to go to Wayne State?
I did, and I grew up in Escanaba, which is not a huge town. It's not a small town either. It's a city, and there's an amazing cultural, like musical vibe and scene up in this town. But it's also a blue collar town, so you know, I've always been around music in my normal day to day life as a result. But when I moved to Detroit, all of a sudden I was living right down by Wayne State. I lived at the Park Sheldon,
Oh
which
yeah.
is right by the Art Institute, and I was in the middle of the city, and I'm like walking to the 5900 building in the cold with my
There
with my.
was a breakfast place inside that building, the Park.
Oh yeah,
I used to eat there. Of course, we all used to go across the street from the music building, the Circa 1890.
circa.
So that's still there.
Yep.
You know what? I was playing in an orchestra concert one time, and we all wanted to go across the street afterwards to go to the Circa. Well, that particular night, it was too crowded. We couldn't get in. So we went next door. I don't know if this was still there when you were there, the Bellcrest Hotel,
Remember that place? Yeah.
right across the street on Cass Avenue. And we were all in our tuxes and we all had our instruments with us. The bassoon player in the orchestra, Don Bartkowiak, he
Mhm.
was a very good jazz piano player, still is, I guess. And he said, "Hey, John, let's get up there and play a tune in the
Mhm.
bar." I said, "Gonna play a tune." She says, "No, let's go." So I took off my bass and he sat down at the piano and we're playing a couple of tunes. And then we sat down. The manager came up to us and hired us. We had a gig there for 4 months.
They worked.
And it was cool. You remember George Benson, the saxophone player, George Benson, the local? Yeah. Well, he used to come and check us out. And what was it? Arnoldi and Lawson and all the professors and all they used to come across the street and all our friends would come. It was great. We had a gig there, just a duo, piano and upright bass.
Yeah. When
Ringing
I
out.
went to Wayne State, I was fortunate to have the teachers I mentioned, but also I took a class in rock and roll history and was taught by John Sinclair, who is the John Sinclair that John Lennon wrote a song about. John Sinclair, John Sinclair. He was the manager of the MC5. So learning the music that I was originally inspired by kind of one of the guys who was really in the middle of, you know, that era of music when it mattered the most, the late 60s. God, he had such a depth of knowledge of the old school stuff. And that was a lot of the information, a lot of the inspiration, and a lot of the, take it back to the original stuff came from John, definitely.
Wow, great experience. So, how did you stay in Detroit after you went to Wayne? And is that where your career really started? That chapter in your career?
It did. I think I put out my first solo record in 1994, 95 called Freudian Slip.
I,
And I got a record
I have
deal.
I have a CD somewhere. Oh,
Yeah, I had to deal with a label on the West Coast called Legato, but that was kind of inspired by. It was right around the time I met you. I was featured in Guitar Player magazine. He used to have a Mike Varney used to have a column called
yep,
Spotlight,
yep.
and
Trap
I
record.
got
Yeah.
and it was amazing the amount of communication and connections that I got through that. And then years later, I ended up working with Mike Varney on playing on quite a few records. I used to play with one of his artists named Tony McAlpine. See, that was kind of it was right when I was wrapping up my Detroit era. I'd been in a band called Edwin Dare, and then I decided to move to LA. And because of that Spotlight column, I started playing with another shredder, as they were called at the time, Tony McAlpine, who's
Yeah.
great player. And, that got me into some additional session work, doing some other Shrapnel records. But then I took a brief detour and I came back to Detroit and I got hired by the Illich family to run a recording studio for them. And I did a lot of the in-stadium music for the Red Wings and for the Tigers
I didn't know.
and for the Detroit Rockers, which they had at the time. And I also was the music director for Atanas Illich's band at the time called Weathervane.
Atanas. He spelled his name all lowercase letters, right?
I think Atanas. Yeah, he was their youngest kid.
Yeah.
Talented guy, good songwriter. So that lasted a couple of years, but I was kind of ready to move on from Detroit by that point. So I ended up heading back out to LA, and it was good timing. There's some other things beyond music that allowed me to be successful when I was there. I owned a house in Detroit. I'd purchased just right before I'd gone back out, and when I got back out to Detroit, the real estate market had been at the bottom because it was right after the Northridge earthquake. So, almost one of the first things I did there before I had a gig at all was I bought a townhouse for $110,000, which if anybody who's ever tried to buy a house in LA knows, they're like, you bought a townhouse in LA for 110 grand. I did. And then I had a roommate that afforded me the luxury of, not having a lot of overhead and living in LA, kind of starting out as a sideman, as they said. And I took some time and, you're in the trenches. I did some cruise ship gigs for a while. I did some theatrical work. But slowly but surely, you work your way into the scene and uh, you just start meeting musicians. You get into the crowd at the Baked Potato, which is really kind of ground zero for all the musicians in LA because it was built by musicians, kind of for musicians. And you know, the music business, no matter where you go on earth, is all about social connections and building communities of people. Um, at the end of the day, people hire their friends. Um,
Yes.
they when you're on the road, especially, you're with someone 24 hours a day. You might be on stage for, if you're headlining, 90 minutes a day. What are you going to do the other 22 and a half hours? You have to hang out with these people. You have to have a human relationship with people. So there is a true art to being in a band over long periods of time. A lot of it has nothing to do with music at all. And so slowly but surely, ended up becoming a road dog. Um, I did I used to put together club shows for a guy named Ivan Kane, who had a big club in Los Angeles called 40 Deuce. And he always had like burlesque style shows. But he wanted to do a rock and roll burlesque show, but he wanted to do, at the time, no one could really figure out what he wanted, but what he wanted was a live band with the original lead vocal of of the tracks. And today it would be easy because the stems are so readily available for, all of the famous songs. But I ended up getting a studio together in LA, and so I was doing sessions for people, but I ended up using my studio to produce shows too. So, cutting things up, learning how to put things on a grid, making a performable show, being a leader of, basically just staffing a show. Who are the cats that I'm going to hire for this gig? Who's the backup? Who's third string? It's if a show's running every week, 2 nights a week, you got to keep the ball rolling, man. And, not everybody can make every show. So, you get good at all of those things. A lot of those skills I learned from my parents just because they were such leaders of the artistic community up here, of putting things together, of creating things. And so that's where I really started to kind of find my own niche. And then I started doing the Uncle Kracker gig. He's another Detroit guy. Did that for a while. Mike Bradford was the bass player in the early stuff, and then Mike got really busy as a producer, so I took over the gig for a couple of years. It was a lot of fun doing that, and that was the first time I had a chance to play all the late night shows at the time, and Leno and Letterman, and that was kind of that era.
Yeah.
And I did that for a while, and then ended up doing whatever I did. It's hard to keep track sometimes. Eventually, I talk about people. I knew this drummer named Mike Tirana from when I was playing with McAlpine, and then he moved to Europe and he was playing with this Finnish artist that I'd never heard named Tadia Turunen. And they were in Los Angeles, and she's a trained operatic singer, and they're playing heavy metal. And I'm like, what is this? I'd never heard this stuff. But we all hit it off, had a great hang backstage, and lo and behold, 2 months later, I get a call, hey, are you interested in playing bass for Tadia? I'm like, sure. So for the next 10 years, I ended up spending most of my time in Europe because she's a Finnish artist. I think in that time, we only did maybe 5 or 6 shows in the United States. Everything else was overseas, all over the world, South America, Asia, I think over 90 countries by the time it all wrapped up. The very last tour I did with her was Ukraine, actually. Every big city in Ukraine right before everything went down with the pandemic and stuff. So I was really grateful for that because, first of all of a sudden I was the only American in the band. I'm playing in a full European band, and we're traveling the world, and you start to get these observations like, Europeans are accepted into the world in completely different ways than Americans are. The world has a different view of Americans than Europeans. But since I was kind of sliding in behind the cracks, I almost got, a European's perspective on how the world really is. And I got to be very good friends with everybody over there. I tried moving to Europe for a bit, but you got to kind of look forward to the different things. And while that was going on is when I started working with Sebastian Bach as well. And in the off time, at first I was a sub. Then that turned into a full-time gig, I think in 2015. A little bit before that, I think I skipped over. I started working with Chad Smith from the Chili Peppers, another Detroit guy. We have a band called the Bombastic Meatbats, which we ended up putting out 3 records. And that was like we used to kind of call it our poker club. We'd get together and play for the sake of playing because everybody in the band was busy doing things, but we kind of lost touch with why we started in the first place, which was just to have fun. So it was kind of our baked potato band, and really was playing with a drummer like Chad Smith. I remember the very first gigs. We'd recorded the records before we did any gigs. We didn't even have a band name when we started. But then we did our first show at the Baked Potato, and Chad's just playing with Chad's amazing. But I remember the first gig, he counts the first song in, and I've never felt the power of a drummer who just owns it like Chad Smith, man. It was like, as a bass player, you got to go there or you're going to get run over like a freight train, man. And that really was like a transformational just moment in my bass playing career.
Excuse me, what about when he plays with Flea? Does Flea push back, or do they meet in the middle, or does Chad run over? The thing that you just described. What is that dynamic like when he's playing with Flea?
He's a very interactive player. he listens so closely, and if you play something, he's gonna respond to it. He's you know he's got a very very jazz sense of playing rock and roll music. He's kind of Elvin Jones like in his ear and his sound and his approach, and he just lays down such a strong foundation for any bass player to play over. I mean, it's a true honor to play with Chad. Just and he's such a great guy, man.
Elvin Jones. Speaking of Michigan
Yes,
legends.
there's so many great musicians from LA. But back to my timeline. Then I was playing with Sebastian, and then um, that lasted for years and years and years, all the way up until um, the pandemic. We had a huge tour booked. I think it was 3 or 4 months. Probably I can't remember how many shows, and then the pandemic happened, and so for whatever reason, it's almost 5 years exactly to this day. It was St. Patrick's Day 2000, and I have another band called Cosmo Squad. We're getting ready to do some shows, which is kind of a progressive instrumental rock band. And we just done some shows, and Alan Parsons was out, and then right after that was all of a sudden this doom and gloom pandemic thing set in, and so I loaded my van and I moved back to Escanaba, and I kept my house in LA for a while. I thought this was just going to be temporary, but I'd already started to come back here in the summertime because I found it to be um, such a comfortable place to practice. I always had a hard time being creative and practicing in Los Angeles because so much of it's based on social networking, and you got to work a lot if you're living in LA. Anybody that's been there, I mean, it's you got to really go for it. And when I was doing all these difficult gigs, especially with Tadia, that's pretty challenging music. I used to come back here in the summer and spend time with my dad, and I would practice 6, 7 hours a day. And I live right on Lake Michigan, and I'd be looking at the lake while I'm practicing. I'm like, this is fantastic. It reminded me when I was a kid, when all my sisters and my brother both went to Interlochen up in northern Michigan. It kind of had that vibe, you know.
You didn't go there?
I didn't go there. I wish I would have, but that was the first step, and then the pandemic happened, and that kind of put me here for a couple of years. There were no gigs. And then, because there was no gigs, I tried getting into some different things. I've always kind of believed in my hometown. So I started getting involved kind of with kind of bringing the music scene back to life here a little bit. And I started working with this group called Visit Escanaba, which is kind of the tourism board of this area. And they always very much respected what I'd done, which is, kind of leave a small town and go out and do some cool things. And so they brought me on just kind of to create content for them. And that eventually led to putting together a huge music festival here a couple of years back. We brought Keith Urban in. Sebastian played the gig. I think it was the largest live music event in the Upper Peninsula ever. And we had 17,000 people.
Great.
And so, that kind of gave me some access to not just the musicians in town, but kind of to, the leaders in town, the people with the Chamber of Commerce, and people with, the people that wanted to make this place a better place for their own different reasons, whether they're business people or whatever. And all of a sudden it was different. And this is what people have said to me all the times. All of a sudden it just felt like the artistic community and the cultural side of things had a seat at the table. So a lot of my work since then has been kind of based on reinvigorating this music scene up here that I emerged from a long time ago. And after I stopped working for Visit Escanaba, I took on this crazy project. I was the director of operations for the restoration and the reopening of the oldest hotel in Michigan, called the House of Ludington. And it's right on the end of Escanaba's Main Street. And when I was a kid, I used to go in there and watch kind of the big bands play, the Ivan Kabasic Orchestra and the Chet Merrier Seven. I'd be this little kid riding his bike down there, and I'd go in and see all these, cool people hanging out, dressed up and stuff.
Excuse me,
And
Ludington, isn't that where you can take a cruise across the lake to Chicago? Is that right?
that's not that's a little bit further south. That's down in Manitowoc, I think, over from Ludington. Ludington is the town in Lower Peninsula, but Ludington, I can't remember. I think his name was Nelson Ludington. He was a lumber baron. So there's a lot of things in the Upper Peninsula that are also named after Mr. Ludington as a result of the lumber industry up here. But I took on this crazy project. It was this behemoth of a hotel. And, no one had the courage to do it. And I was getting sick of people saying, no one's ever going to do it. And so I took on the director of operations gig. There's an investor from Chicago that purchased the place because I believed in it and it was in the neighborhood I grew up in. But more importantly, I was living here now and I needed a place to play music live. And so my motivation, yeah, sure, was goodwill. But at the end of the day, it's just like that hotel across the street from the Wayne State Music Department that you talked about. My motivation was simply to build this place back up so that I had a gig. And after I handed the reins to the people that are now running it, I've been doing every Wednesday nights with my own band up here called the House Band. And I think we're almost at 100 weeks in a row, and it's a huge success. And it's kind of allowed me to merge my love of my hometown together with my love of music. And, it's a great second act in life. It's been a lot of fun, and it continues to be a lot of fun.
Wow. So what exactly are you doing right now? What's keeping you busy?
Well, I do that every Wednesday. I also play upright at Lee's Garden Winery up here on Thursdays.
Didn't know you played upright.
Yeah. And I still play with a band. I play with a band called Steelheart, which is a early 90s rock band. They had some hits.
Yeah.
And, we do 30, 40 shows a year, I'd say. So I'm on the road. Basically the average is 3 days on the road for every single gig. So if you're doing 30 shows, that's like 3 months a year on the road doing that. And my dad is still here. So I, try to spend time with family. I just got engaged. I'm getting married.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. So there's a lot of things in my personal life that are really, I think of equal importance to music. It always used to be weighted heavily, so, towards music as people that are in the business really kind of end up doing. But life is short, and
Is your fiance in the music world?
she's not.
Does she get you? Does she understand?
Well, the funny thing is, we knew each other when I was first starting out. She used to write me letters when I lived in Detroit at the Park Sheldon. We met a long time ago, but then we fell out of touch, and she ended up having, her daughters and living a full life herself. And I ended up, going off and doing all the things I just mentioned. And we both ended up back here building new houses during the pandemic and just kind of coming out of it. And we got together and here we are. So it's a beautiful relationship. Her name's Julie. And when you meet people in midlife on a personal level, romantically speaking, God, there's so much to explain, And the beautiful thing about us is we knew each other before all of that stuff happened. So there's no explaining necessary. And life is beautiful that way.
Well, that's great. You're not the type of guy that does a lot of sitting around, are you?
I like to keep it moving, man. I've had some health problems through the years. The things I didn't mention is I had brain surgery in 2011, I think it was, which was a challenge. But I got out of it okay. In fact, my biggest career years were after I had brain surgery. Recently, I had cancer. I had surgery at U of M. Come through that fine. So I'm still trucking along. And I think whenever you go through, life-threatening health experiences, I'm sure there's probably people that are watching that can relate to this. I mean, you kind of come out the other side with a different perspective, and every day matters even more. Every gig matters even more. And you just want to you don't want it to change. You don't want it to get better. You just want it to keep going. I don't want anything to change. I just want to keep playing music like I do, keep, loving Julie and having the opportunity to live in this beautiful place up here and have the opportunity to continue to travel with Steelheart. We've got some China shows later this year. So we still do international stuff too. And I'm extraordinarily lucky. I can't I can't deny it that I was handed and dealt a very interesting uh, uh, hand, shall we say, in life. And um, all the experiences, whether it's Detroit or Los Angeles or Escanaba on either end now, it's been, it's the mix that's created who I am today. And I love every little bit of it. No regrets.
That's beautiful. You ever get down to the Lower Peninsula at the to we're in mid Michigan now, actually. We moved
Oh,
to the
yeah.
Detroit area.
Okay.
We're in the Lansing area, actually, east of
Nice.
near the capital.
Yeah. I get down there occasionally. I've got to actually bring my upright down to Duluth here. Got a couple of repairs that I need taken care of. But my good friend Brian Lord still lives in Detroit. He's a professional guitarist. He works for the Trudell family. I'm sure you knew Johnny Trudell, and
Very well.
yeah, I went to school with Jeff. I think I can't remember his other brother's name, but he's an agent in town. So it's. I'm sorry. Go ahead,
Steve.
Steve. Thank you. And we're riffing here, but Dennis Teeney's brother used to play bass for him, Ray Teeney.
Ray Teeney, yeah. He played for it was with Paul Anka, I think, in Vegas. And who were you talking about, Joe? Who used to play with with Trudell, yeah, at the Fox Theater. Yeah, he was the contractor there.
So I still have a lot of friends in Detroit, and I get down there occasionally. I've got a show in Bowling Green coming up in April with my band Cosmo Squad. We're playing a show at Sweetwater in Fort Wayne
Cool.
On that same run of dates. So uh, I think earlier this year we did a show in Flint at the arena there. So I'd never played Flint before, so that's the first time I'd played
I
there.
don't think I have either. Had much desire to, much reason to go there would be
Yeah,
another way of putting that.
it's like one of those towns. It's so close to Detroit. They don't necessarily have a lot of shows there, but that
Yeah.
was really cool. And I briefly lived in Ann Arbor, kind of in my Detroit time too. I had an uncle that lived there, and I lived with some family. But I've always really loved Ann Arbor as well, and the rich cultural scene that's down there. And
Zingerman's Deli or whatever they are. Deli.
yeah, there's just I like the Blind Pig and all
Yeah.
those that whole vibe down there is.
Actually, my wife and I went to Ann Arbor on our first date.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we ate at Grazie, and then we went to the Bird of Paradise.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that club, jazz club? And what was Ron Brooks, was that the guy?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Hey, tell me about your gear. What kind of basses are you playing, and strings and amps and effects and all that good stuff?
Well, behind me, these are my 5 string Ernie balls. These are the ones that I used when I was doing, more of the rock stuff on the road.
Yeah.
Um, my main one this is, I think, a late 80s Ernie Ball 5 string. My main bass here, I've got an original year Music Man, one of the first 1,000 Music Mans ever made.
Wow.
So it was probably, it was probably set up by Leo Fender. It's an amazing instrument. I love playing that bass.
Yeah.
I've got a kind of a mid 60s Fender Jazz that I use for sessions. Got a kind of an early 70s P bass. But I've been with Ernie Ball for many years, and they've always been very supportive of me with the different things that I've done. And from my experience, they're pretty much it's a very universal instrument for me to use on the various gigs that I've done. It always seems to work. But before I was that, I have a couple of Ken Smiths.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Ken Smith 6, and I've got a BT4 neck through.
When we were talking about John Patitucci and the mid 80s and the six string, I used to hang out with him also which is in Pacific Palisades, I think, at the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
His,
I went with my 5-month-old son, who's now 37, and he's married and he's got 2 kids of his own, but he was a baby. We went to Patitucci's and hung out.
that's really cool. And
Those necks are so wide on those Ken Smith 6 strings.
when I was into playing my 6 string, I was into Patitucci. I was into Anthony Jackson too.
Yes, well, that's the other big name of that era, and that
He played on a Michelle Camilo record, which is just amazing. There's a version of Caravan by Michelle Camilo with Anthony Jackson on bass, for those that are watching. It's fantastic. But since you asked me about my gear, um, I worked with Mark Bass. That's the company that I've worked with for a very long time as far as my day-to-day bass stuff. But when I'm on the road, I always backline just your standard Ampeg SVT. Not on the Steelheart gig, two of them, because it's the loudest band I have ever played in my life.
Are you an Ampeg artist?
I am not an Ampeg artist. I've thought of contacting them. I kind of early on in my career, I was really focused on endorsements and working with companies and I don't know. For whatever reason, I like the people that have treated me well. Like Marco at Mark Bass has been so kind to me. I still use the Mark Bass stuff constantly, especially for smaller gigs. It doesn't translate as well for the bigger gigs for me. The Ampeg stuff you really do need. Sorry about all that noise. But so I still work with them. I've got a Tech 21 thing going on. I use various things from them. I like the dark glass pedals.
Use the same amp?
What's that?
Sans amp, Tech
Yeah.
21.
Yeah, that's always been really useful to me. I kind of work with a pedal board. I've got something called Le Bass that I use as kind of my main preamp. And when you do fly dates, you're a lot of times there's no sound check. You're just plugging in, especially on the festival dates.
Yeah.
And it's really not it's not what it sounds like on stage. It's more about what the front of house and the monitor desk is getting direct signals. So many years I spent a lot of time, getting my bass tone together with my pedal board through my studio rig so that I knew what I was sending front of house. And the stage tone that I was getting was really more for my personal reference than it was for anything. I'd always put, I personally prefer a Sennheiser 421 on whatever amp I'm using. I've always played with a cable. I am not a believer in wireless for bass at all, personally. I think it really does affect the quality of the tone, especially on the bottom end. Um, that's what I'm using live in the studio. I've got a couple of API preamps that I love. Distressors always sound really good if you're doing some recording. Like a Neve 1073 or 1031, whatever Neve preamp you can have. If you've got a good compressor with it, you should be able to get some pretty good results. I've got a really old Ampeg B15, one of the really early year pop tops that I love. And I use that for a lot of reamping. What else do I have? I'm sure you're in the same boat. My God, sometimes I feel like my gear reproduces on itself. It's like it's in there having babies. I open up the closet one day and it's like, where did all this stuff come from? It's like,
No, actually, I'm not that big of a gearhead, but companies send me stuff. Brubeck just sent me a bass, and Kala U bass.
Mm-hmm.
Just sent me a couple the other day, and for product placement and stuff in my videos. What kind of strings do you use? Do you use Ernie Ball strings as well?
Balls. Typically the cobalts I like. They're a little bit more magnetic than the standards, but if I want a little bit more of a normal bass tone, that's for the rock stuff. For the regular stuff, I still like the Slinkies. They always work.
Yeah.
I used to change my strings a lot when I was on the road because when you're doing the big stadium stuff, you're sweating like a pig. So you actually are going through strings like crazy. But I don't know. I've kind of become a little bit more old fashioned in my 50s. I play the bass and I let it. I make it sound different with my fingers rather than worrying about, do I need to change the strings?
You remind me of, I read somewhere about a conversation that Anthony Jackson had with Duck Dunn.
Mm.
And Anthony says, "What kind of strings do you play?" And Duck said, "I don't know. These were on the bass when I got it." And Anthony just about fell over because he changed his string, like twice a day or something ridiculous.
Yeah. It's actually a little harder for me to play on new strings, to be honest with you. They're a little, rough around the edges. So I don't know, I've kind of grown to like a little bit more of the smooth tone. And I think early in my playing career, when I was learning, probably when I met you, and I was, taking summers to learn Paganini and jonesing out on Anthony Jackson and John Patitucci, you're learning busy stuff. You're really learning, bass featured stuff. But
Got
then,
a match. Got a match. Remember that one?
oh
Do-do.
yes, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but as time goes on, my playing's become a little bit more expressive. I mean, I'm probably playing more bass solos in Escanaba these days than I ever played in my life. So I feel like I'm still growing as a musician and trying different things. I still play the Bach G major cello suite every single day.
Wow.
That's kind of, to me, that's it's I pull a bass off the shelf and I play that. It's kind of the canary in the coal mine of where my playing is that day. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, here's what I'm feeling, and
On the upright. God, those were a bitch.
yeah, it's so there's a lot of the things that I learned early on that I still carry forward with me on a daily basis. And I remember I remember when I had my brain surgery, I came out of it, and what I didn't expect, it was difficult to get work coming out of that, especially brain surgery, because I didn't really factor in. I called it the zombie impression, that everybody had the impression that you come out of brain surgery, you're gonna be like a walking zombie, not a bass player. So I had to kind of defeat that impression. I'd kind of become a professional patient through my time, because there was a good 6-8 months where I was dealing with it. So when I got the Tadia gig back, because I was off it for, I guess, about 6 months or a year, it was no one wants to take a bass player or any musician on the road when they've got a health problem, because there's risk involved. And when you're on the road, especially overseas, there's plane flights, there's all of those things. And one person having those problems really can throw the whole organization into disarray. And there's a lot of money on the line. And so I understood it. But when I had the opportunity to get the gig back, that's when I first started coming here. And man, I was not going to let the past be carried forward. So I remember thinking to myself at the time that you get one chance to make a first impression, right? And there was the very first thing that I play with these guys that I know personally, I'm dear friends with. That is going to be what they think of where I'm at after my medical condition. And I want them to play one song with me and say to themselves that I could never play this music again without Kevin on bass, right? I wanted it to just be exactly what it's supposed to be. And so the first show, I think, was in the Czech Republic. Flew over there. It was great to see everybody, and we did sound check, and we did a song. And Chris, the keyboard player, kind of a German, doesn't really say much, just came over and gave me a hug. And I'm closest with Alex Schulp, the guitar player, who still is in the band. I still talk to him all the time. And he came to me after sound check, and he said, "I missed you so much, man, on stage." And he said, "I love playing with you because you create a carpet of confidence on stage for everybody else around you." And so that was just kind of, it confirmed what I wanted to try to do, but more importantly, it gave me a whole new perspective on really what the job of being a bass player is. Your job is to create a carpet of confidence on stage for everybody else around you to go off and be fearless. You're the root. You're connecting the whole organization to the earth itself, man. And if you think of it this way and you approach every gig this way, like my job is to make every person, whether it's someone who's not a professional musician, just up here in Escanaba, which I'm doing all of the time, my job is to make them sound good. Or if it's with Chad, my job is to make Chad Smith sound good. My job is to make Tadia Turunen sound good, and take myself out of it and realize that the role I play is much bigger than me. And you go through a health problem, and all of these different ways of seeing the world around you start to emerge, and they kind of come together with your musical tastes and philosophies. And you've got, by this point, a couple of decades of experience for me at the time. And it made me realize how music is really a deep, deep thing. But at the end of the day, it's a really simple thing on a human level. And if you think of it in a selfless way, you can really achieve some amazing results.
It's beautiful. Great perspective. I'm glad you're doing well. And I can relate. I went through a serious health issue also that I still have. I have a movement disorder,
Mm.
neurological movement disorder in the entire right side of my body.
Ooh.
And in April of this year will be 19 years since it first got really bad. I was at the Mayo Clinic 3 times. I was at the
Oh.
New York Presbyterian Hospital. I was at Detroit Medical Center, Cleveland Clinic. I went to Muhammad Ali's doctor for 10 days. That's when I started my business. I was
Yeah.
in the hospital for 10 days. I needed something to do. Somebody wrote me, sent me an email from England. He says, John Liebman, this was 2008 already. And he said, I love your books. I love your stuff. I love what you do. I looked all over the internet and I can't believe there's no johnliebman.com.
Mm.
And I went,
There you go.
and that's how I started it. But I think you've got such a healthy, such a positive attitude. I think it's great. And I think that's some of the things you said are a great transition to the next question that I wanted to ask you. I have students coming to for bass players only, which is primarily a bass instruction site. Yes, I've got 900 and some interviews. Never missed a Monday since June 15th, 2009. A new interview every week. But in addition to that, we have our instructional programs. I have a membership, a couple digital courses. And right now, today, this minute, I've got people from every state in the US and I don't even know by now, 50, 60, 70 countries worldwide. People coming to for bass players only every day to learn how to play bass. And
Mhm.
most of these people are of the silver aged vintage. I have students in their 50s, 60s, 70s. I have students in their 80s, men
Mhm.
and women. So they're not career bound. They're not looking to play sold out arenas to adoring fans all over the world. They
Mhm.
want to get together with their buddies and play some classic rock riffs and some blues shuffles, or maybe some walking bass or some funk R&B. And actually, a lot of them are content just to sit in a room alone and just do it and work on it and have fun and play with recordings or study and learn. And one other thing, just to give you some context, when we get into our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, sometimes things like arthritis and tendonitis and recovering from surgery and bursitis and shoulders and this and that. So I'm telling you all this just to let you know who I'm talking about here. Not everybody, suffers from those bodily nuisances, but
Mhm.
having said all that, Kevin, what advice could you impart to somebody like that who wants to learn bass? Because I remember when I was 17, my goals were all wrong. I wanted to play fast. I wanted to be Stanley. I wanted to be Jocko. I wanted to be Jeff Berlin. All that. No. Then I learned what it means to be a bass player. So I have a much more mature approach to it. So, what advice, what should they be thinking about? What should their goals be? What should they be working on, striving for? Jump in anywhere.
Hmm. Well, I guess understanding how much music matters in the world at this particular point in time in history, I think is important because there's a lot of really dark energy I feel in the world today. People are really, really angry with each other and they disagree so often, especially if you follow social media. It's hard for everybody right now. But music is a universal thing and it's been around for centuries for a reason. It's an antidote to our souls for being present in the moment in which it's created if it's played live. You can get everybody to back away from whatever minds that they have and just be in the same place at the same time. That could be if you are one of the musicians or if you're someone who's just enjoying the music. And you know, as far as as advice for them as musicians, I personally to this day, I work with Ortega. I've got all their little mini basses, and I play around the house all the time. And there's a radio station up here, old AM station. They probably had the same playlist since like 1972. All of the hits of the time.
Listen to that.
I play along with the radio constantly. I think that if you're asking for advice for anybody, I would say learn as many songs as you possibly can. Number one, um, and if you're a bass player, you're going to get better the more you play, no matter what you do. But when you learn different songs, you give it a palette in which it's like giving yourself blank slates every day in which to grow as a musician. I would, learning how to do a basic chart of a song so that you can look at it on paper and just even if you're just nailing the roots, to say, okay, the root is A on this part, A, two measures, sketch it out. What's the next chord change? F sharp. Okay. And then you take it to the next level. Okay. The first chord is A7. If you really want to go there, it's whatever, F sharp minor seven. You start getting into how to think of chord changes first. Because then once you understand chord changes, especially as a bass player, you can start to, use the knowledge that you're learning through the books like you put out, because all of that stuff is it's based around learning the important fundamentals of what we do. But the opposite side of learning and growing as a musician is learning how it's been applied in other places. Doing That's what the real study of music is to me, and it can be based around classic rock, whatever it might be. There's so much great music out there. And I've found through the years, by taking that approach of learning chord changes, when I work with other musicians on a gig and I call a tune and they don't know it, I give them the changes. I can write them a chart on a napkin in 2 seconds and we play it, and learning those fundamentals of being a even if you're not a professional musician, it's a technique that professional musicians use to be a working musician through the years. I mean, those are the, if I said that there was a skill that has carried my career forward, it's learning songs. I've always been really, really good at learning songs and having a very, very large library of music in my head to be able to play by ear. And I think a great place to start building up that muscle is just find a radio station that still plays music continuously or use a Spotify playlist. Be surprised. Don't learn something that you already know and are familiar with. Just whatever comes up, just say, hey, this sounds like an interesting song. I have no idea what it is. What was the song because I started singing up here, if you want to learn, Roger Miller, The Last Farewell, for you are beautiful, learn those chord changes, learn the song, and it's never gonna fail you. And it will always be a tool that you can carry forward to do what you want to do as a musician. Build out the library of music that you personally know. That's what I would recommend anybody.
I think that's great advice. And people will soon realize the more they do what you're suggesting, the more they'll realize how much these songs have in common, and they can start to predict where they're going to go next. Because there's a one chord, a four chord, and a five chord in there somewhere in
Yeah.
near every song you've ever heard,
Yeah.
except Get Back by the Beatles. There's no five chord in that song.
Yeah. No. I mean, I played with Chuck Berry briefly. I mean, you mentioned some of the artists I played with. I mean, it's like, being able to do gigs like that, or even when I lived in Detroit, I played with Martha Reeves a couple of times because Matt Michaels and all those guys were like, they're always putting bands together to back up all of those old artists back in the day. That's kind of where that started for me is, get a call. Hey, you're playing with little Anthony in the Imperials, or you're playing with the Tokens, and you got to learn The Lion Sleeps Tonight. You're constantly learning material. I have a file cabinet full of transcriptions of all of the gigs I've done through the years. And that has really, that's become really what I bring to the table as a musician is knowledge of music.
That's great. You remind me of my Miami years when I used to play all those oldies shows. Like
Yeah.
Dimension and all that. Oh, it was
Yeah.
great. You mentioned a few things. I kept you longer than I had intended, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity. What about the future? Anything that you haven't mentioned yet that you either you have coming up, or is there some other project, something else you've always wanted to do but haven't gotten to yet? Or, someday I'm gonna fill in the blank. Anything
I'm
like
working on a few books right now, which is that's a new thing for me. Not necessarily instructional books, but books.
that?
I've always been into writing, so that's a whole new thing for me. I've been doing a radio show, come up on the 5 year anniversary up here every Friday. So that's been something you can see it every week on my Facebook page, Kevin Chown, if you're interested in checking it out. And it's me in a small town, this Los Angeles dude hanging out in Escanaba, and the contrast is really cool. I love that. I've got the shows that I mentioned with Cosmo Squad coming up. I've got all the shows that I have with Steelheart. We're in Spokane, Washington next week, and then we're in Pittsburgh and Vineland, New Jersey the following week. And just check out my social media. I stay pretty active on there. Um,
You stay pretty active, period.
yeah, exactly. But as far as new things for me, I mean, come on up to Escanaba, Michigan anytime.
I
Come to
would
the House Ludington on a Wednesday night. Come
love.
and see my band up here called the House Band. And, you know, uh, I think that's kind of where I see my future is, becoming more established where I'm from over time as a musician. I think it's the natural course of things. I'll never retire. I have to play music for the rest of my life. And you've got to create gigs for yourself. Gigs aren't going to find you no matter where you are. And if you do the work and you learn songs and you learn how to be an entertainer, God, you'll work for the rest of your life. And that's I see that as the path moving forward indefinitely.
I would love to get up there. I think all these years, all these decades in Michigan, I've been up to the Upper Peninsula, I think once.
Really?
I was playing with Leslie Gore.
Oh, really? Okay. It's my party and I cry if I want to.
That's the one. Yep. Hey, I have one last question for you.
Yes.
If you could imagine, I know you're more than a bass player. You mentioned horns and other instruments, but my signature sign-off question: what would you be if you were not a bass player? So tell me something outside of music.
If I went back to college and I had to do it all over again, I'd probably study philosophy or history. I'd probably be doing something with those two, lines of interest. I used to teach in Detroit too. So there's a point in my time of my life that I did do some teaching. And I would probably be in that area. I don't really know. You know, Being a musician isn't selecting a career. It's kind of, finding an identity, because music as a career choice is so deeply related to who you are personally. Um, I think once you've done it for as long as we have, it's difficult to see where I would be able to kind of fit in that way. But I think there's ways to, there's always ways to find different ways to challenge yourself and move in different directions. It's I've always had an interest in history. Like one of the side projects I've been doing up here since I had all this time during the pandemic and since my parents were so involved in music is historical archive work. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of the musicians that I work with now on gigs up here because of my parents and my brother. They're all much older than me, but because I used to see them play when I was a kid, I knew the families that they came from. I was familiar with all the different bands that were from here. My mom and dad had a quarter-inch tape library in the basement that had been sitting there for years. And so I started digitizing it during the pandemic. And like, for example, I found this one concert of my dad's band with Doc Severinsen as the soloist, which blew my mind. And it led me down this rabbit hole of basically digitizing Escanaba music history. And, you start to get into your 50s, and I think you kind of start thinking about what you're going to leave as a legacy. And, if I could leave something as my legacy, it's just that um, I had an appreciation and took the time to document the musical history of a place that's always been near and dear to my heart and the place that I believe in and something that I think is overlooked and extremely impressive. And I'll continue to do that work on a historic level, and hopefully it will matter to people in the future. And I'm trying to think of the things that the work that I'm able to do with the rest of my life. I'm trying to think about how it's going to matter after I'm not around anymore.
Well, I think you are extremely impressive.
Thanks, John.
Doc Severinsen's not from Escanaba, is he?
No, they flew him in for a concert right before he got the Tonight Show gig. Actually, it's
Wow.
I'll send it to you. It'll blow your mind. It's
Wow.
amazing. There's all kinds of stuff like that up here. My dad's uh, the first recording and the earliest one was from 1946. My dad's from Sault Ste. Marie. It was on a 78, and it was his high school concert or kind of dance band, I think they called it, playing in Washington, D.C. They played some concerts out there for what was maybe the Lions Club, because Sault Ste. Marie was a big place during World War II. And so they flew out the Sault Ste. Marie groups to play at the Pentagon when it was initiated. And the person that spoke before my dad's performance was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. I found this historic recording of Dwight Eisenhower in my parents' collection, right? So, I started scratching back the surface of all this stuff. And that's the stuff that fascinates me. And, being able to package that together into something and to be able to tell the story of it all, it's a labor of love. I enjoy doing it. And, everybody has a hobby. That's kind of my hobby.
It sounds like some of those recordings should be in the Library of Congress.
I agree with you. They're amazing.
I think we better call it here because I could never run out of stuff to talk to you about. I could never get tired of listening to you. I'm so glad we reconnected after all these years, and we're just right up the road from each other, probably 8 or 10 hours up the road, but I don't know how far Escanaba.
If you're in Lansing, you're about 5 or 6 hours away.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, not bad. Go across the bridge, make a left, go 2 hours.
Well, let's meet at Traverse City in the summertime.
My cousin David Chown's a fantastic musician up in Traverse City. So great jazz player. He was the pianist at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island for years. So he's got a great music scene in Traverse City too. My family's very, extended culturally that way. I'm very blessed. And so to answer your question, I'd love to meet you there.
Let's make a point of getting together in person soon and often.
Absolutely. I would love
All
that.
right, my friend Kevin Chown, thank you so much. And yeah, look forward to this. This has been incredibly inspiring and uplifting. And I love so many of the things that you said. I love everything that you said, but there are a few things in particular about just such a healthy and energetic and inspiring attitude. It just makes me feel good.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thanks, my friend. We'll talk soon.
Have a great day.
You too. What an amazing interview. What an inspiring, uplifting guy. Love Kevin. And he is just I hope you stuck with it because there's a lot of stuff in there, and I hope you got a lot of great takeaways. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. If you've ever wanted to learn bass, but you think you're too old or your body won't cooperate or anything like that, you should know that right now there are thousands of people inside the For Bass Players Only community, men and women of all ages. And you know what they're doing? They're learning bass. They're having the time of their life playing music that they love. Come join them and experience that incredible transformation for yourself. You're never too old to groove. I will see you right back here next week, same time, same place, with another bass player interview right here on ForBassPlayersOnly.com. In the meantime, I'm John Liebman. Let's play bass.